All right, continuing here in chapter 7 of How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, the Gospels. We're going to be on slide number 13. They give, again, some background here in Mark's Gospel, okay? One of the things that Mark was attempting to do was he was attempting to explain the nature of Jesus' messiahship in light of Isaiah's second Exodus. Okay, Isaiah talks about this Exodus that's going to occur that is different from, obviously the Israelites' Exodus from Egypt. And part of that is the Exodus out of sin. And that's what Mark's gospel is drawing from, trying to tell that story, okay? Although Mark knows that the Messiah is the strong Son of God who moves through Galilee with power and compassion, he also knows that Jesus repeatedly kept his messiahship hidden. And again, part of Mark's gospel is such that they believe that it was the memoirs of Peter, is that Peter most likely communicated his memory of Jesus, his memory of his life and his ministry, and Mark wrote it down. And what we have is that, and Mark wrote it down shortly after the Apostle Peter was martyred in Rome. So if you go on to slide number 14, again, I'm not going to get into Luke or John or Matthew deeply on here. That would be the subject of like a New Testament survey class. But again, each gospel writer had an emphasis. Something else about Mark. Mark was appealing to Romans when he wrote this. Again, it occurred after Peter's martyrdom in Rome. And so one of the things that really appealed to Roman readers of Jesus is his power. Okay, so in the Gospel of Mark, everything happens really, really quickly. In fact, a word that's repeated over and over in the Gospel of Mark is the word immediately. Everything got done quickly, okay? Which is, to a Roman mind, where they're thinking of power and efficiency, yeah, that would make sense. Jesus did this immediately. Immediately they crossed the Sea of Galilee. Immediately, suddenly, a demon-possessed guy showed up, okay? In other words, all this, let's get it done here, okay? Mark's gospel is very fast-paced as compared to Matthew, as compared to Luke or John, okay? Again, he was trying to appeal to a Roman mind. And so power and speed very much appealed to them. Kind of like how we think today to some degree, but anyway. So moving on to slide number 14, understanding the Gospels, understanding individual pericopes, you need to think paragraphs, okay? Again, like you always do when you read the Bible, but probably a little bit less so. Because again, these pericopes can be, stories themselves, and you might have several pericopes even within a paragraph, okay? So they talk about the unique nature of the Gospels. You must think horizontally and vertically, okay? Because the Gospels are two-level documents. So if you go to slide number 15, what does thinking horizontally mean? To think horizontally means that when you study a pericope in any one gospel, it's usually helpful to be aware of the parallels in other gospels. So in other words, a pericope or a saying of Jesus in Matthew might be found in also Mark and Luke. So it's really important if you can see them too. You can kind of compare and contrast the ways that they're used. Okay, you don't want to overdo that. But in other words, don't read the gospels in total isolation with one another. And again, that's why it's helpful to read through Mark and Matthew and Luke and John and kind of go through it. But don't be afraid to compare when you're reading Matthew's gospel. If you find a comparable account in Mark or Luke, compare it with that. That helps you understand it better. Okay. And then they give the first word of caution, though, when we say that. The purpose of studying the Gospels in parallel is to fill out the story in one Gospel with details from the other, okay? Again, that can be helpful, but it can also blur the distinctives of the Gospel. So you can compare and contrast similar sayings in other Gospels, but don't use those exclusively to understand it because, again, Mark's coming at it from one angle, Matthew's coming at it from a very Jewish perspective, Luke's coming at it from the perspective of a doctor, from the perspective of somebody who is very attentive to sicknesses, right? Obviously because of his profession. Luke comes at the gospel trying to elevate women, okay, the role of women And so he focuses a lot on that. Luke comes at it with the focus on the Holy Spirit as empowerment for ministry. In other words, every gospel writer had their emphasis. And so even as you're kind of comparing them and seeing similarities, let the distinctions remain. That's part of their force. That's part of their power. That's part of the beauty of reading the Gospels. If you look at slide number 16, again, thinking horizontally, the two levels of interest, that of Jesus himself in his own context, and that of the author of the gospel written for the readers in view, okay? So in other words, two levels of interest, Jesus and what he's doing, okay? And then also the interest of somebody like Mark or the interest of somebody like Luke, okay? That's going to focus on something differently. Those are kind of two levels you need to look at, okay? Basic reasons for thinking horizontally. The parallels will often give us an appreciation for the distinctive aspects of any one of the Gospels. The parallels will also help us to be aware of the different kinds of context in which the same or similar materials lived in the ongoing church. Again, the more background you can get of the history and of the culture and the customs of first century Judaism and the first century Greco-Roman world, the easier it is to understand and appreciate what's being said in the Gospels and in any of the books in the New Testament. If you go to slide number 17, they talk about most common and unlikely presupposition about the Gospels is that they were all written separately, okay? So they developed this, okay? Case in point, consider the high degree of verbal similarity in the synoptic Gospels. What are the synoptic Gospels? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? Synoptic because of their similarities. Mark was the first, and then Matthew drew upon Mark, and Luke drew upon Mark, okay? We got to realize that these stories were first told in Aramaic, yet it was translated into the Greek, okay? It is highly unlikely that three people in three different parts of the Roman Empire would tell the same story with the same words, even to such minor points as individual style or prepositions or conjunctions. And yet this is what happens over and over in the synoptics, okay? In other words, this high degree of verbal similarity, okay, is telling us that, in other words, it is corroborating the historical legitimacy or the historical veracity that what's in the gospel is what really happened, okay? In other words, the chances of getting people from all kinds of different backgrounds to suddenly converge and tell a compelling story and there's all kinds of continuity and agreement is very unlikely unless they were all telling the truth, okay? That's what they're trying to develop here in that section there, okay? So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to begin with slide number 18.